I never thought I'd tell this story out loud. It's been years, but I can still feel the way the air pressed against my chest that night, as if the woods themselves were alive and didn't want me there. It happened in Yosemite National Park, a place that had always been my escape, my sanctuary, until it became something else entirely. It was the middle of October, and I decided to go on a solo camping trip to clear my head. The breakup, the job stress, life had been too much, and the idea of being surrounded by towering pines and crisp mountain air sounded like the perfect remedy. I should have known better. I arrived at the campground late in the afternoon, a secluded spot tucked deep within the park, far from the popular trails. The ranger who checked me in gave me a funny look when I mentioned where I was headed. "You sure about that site?" he asked. "It's been quiet up there lately. People keep reporting strange stuff." I laughed it off. "Quiet's exactly what I need." He didn't argue, just handed me a map and said, "Stay safe out there." The first night was uneventful. I set up my tent, cooked some instant noodles over a campfire, and let the stillness of the forest settle over me. The stars above seemed infinite, their light cutting through the darkness like tiny beacons of hope. But by the second night, that hope started to flicker. It began with a sound, a faint rhythmic tapping like something knocking against a tree. I figured it was a woodpecker or maybe a branch swaying in the wind. But when I stepped out of my tent to investigate, the forest was still. No wind, no animals, just silence. I shrugged it off and went back to bed, but the tapping returned louder this time and closer. It felt like it was circling my campsite. Tap, tap, tap. My heart started to race. I shone my flashlight into the woods, but the beam barely penetrated the dense trees. Then I saw it, a shadow. It was tall, human-like, but wrong. It stood just beyond the reach of my light, its shape shifting subtly as if it were made of smoke. I froze, my breath caught in my throat. I tried to tell myself it was a trick of the light, but deep down I knew better. "Who's there?" I called out, my voice trembling. No response. The shadow didn't move, it just stood there, watching me. Or at least that's what it felt like. I retreated into my tent and zipped it up, my heart pounding so hard I thought it might burst. I didn't sleep that night. The tapping continued, but now it came from all directions. It was like the forest was alive, mocking me, reminding me how alone I was. By morning, I was exhausted, but I told myself I was overreacting. The third night was when everything fell apart. The tapping didn't wait for nightfall this time. It started at dusk, louder and more erratic. And then came the whispers, low, guttural murmurs that seemed to seep out of the trees themselves. I couldn't make out any words, but the tone was unmistakable, threatening. I decided to leave. I started packing up my gear, my hands shaking so badly I could barely grip the zippers. But as I was stuffing my sleeping bag into its sack, I heard something that made my blood run cold. A voice. "Don't go." It was soft, almost a whisper, but it was clear as day, and it came from inside my tent. I spun around, my flashlight clutched tightly in my hand. The tent was empty. "Who's there?" I demanded, my voice breaking. The only response was laughter. Not the kind of laughter you hear at a campfire or a party, but a hollow, echoing sound that chilled me to the bone. I grabbed my backpack and ran. I didn't care about the rest of my gear. I just wanted to get out of those woods. The trail was barely visible in the fading light, and the trees seemed to close in around me, their branches clawing at my clothes and skin. That's when I heard it, the sound of footsteps behind me. Heavy, deliberate, and far too close. I didn't dare look back. I just kept running, my lungs burning and my legs screaming for me to stop. But the footsteps didn't stop. They got faster, louder, until they were right behind me. And then, they weren't. I stumbled to a halt, gasping for air, and turned around. Nothing. Just the dark, empty forest. That's when I realized the footsteps weren't coming from the ground. They were above me. I looked up, and there it was. The shadow, now fully formed, crouched on a branch like some grotesque predator. Its face, or what should have been a face, was a void, an empty blackness that seemed to suck in the light around it. And then it dropped. I screamed and bolted, my body running on pure adrenaline. The trail blurred as tears streamed down my face, but I didn't stop. Not until I burst out of the woods and onto the road where my car was parked. I fumbled with my keys, my hands shaking so badly I almost dropped them. When I finally got the door open, I threw myself inside and locked it, my eyes darting around the empty parking lot. For a moment, I thought I was safe. But as I turned the key in the ignition, the tapping started again. It was coming from the roof of my car. I didn't look. I couldn't. I slammed my foot on the gas and sped out of there. the sound of tapping following me down the road until it finally faded into the distance. When I reached the ranger station, I must have looked like a lunatic, wild-eyed, covered in dirt, babbling about shadows and whispers. The ranger from before was still on duty. He didn't ask questions, didn't try to calm me down. He just said, "You're lucky to be alive." Not everyone makes it out of those woods. I never went back to Yosemite. I can't even look at pictures of it without feeling that same suffocating dread. Whatever's out there, it's not just trees and animals. It's something older, something that doesn't want us there. And if you're smart, you'll listen to the warnings.
Story number 2.
I don't know why I agreed to go on that trip. Looking back, I think I was just trying to impress my friend Sam. He was the adventurous type, always chasing thrills and dragging me along for the ride. This time, his big idea was a backpacking trip in Great Smoky Mountains National Park. Remote trails, no cell service, nothing but the two of us, and miles of wilderness. It was late September, and the days were getting shorter, the nights colder. We planned to hike a trail that wasn't on most park maps. Sam had found it on some obscure hiking forum. It was supposed to be breathtaking, waterfalls, hidden clearings, and views of the mountains you couldn't get anywhere else. What the forum didn't mention was why it wasn't on the map anymore. The first day went fine. We hiked about 10 miles, set up camp in a small clearing, and cooked dinner over a fire. The forest was eerily quiet as the sun set, but I told myself it was just the isolation. No cars, no people, just nature. Sam loved it. I was less sure. That night, I woke up around 2 a.m. to a sound outside the tent. It was faint at first, like leaves crunching underfoot. I froze, listening. The sound got closer, and it wasn't just footsteps, it was breathing. Slow, deep breaths, the kind that don't belong to any animal I've ever heard. "Sam," I whispered, shaking him awake. He grumbled and sat up. "What's your problem?" "Listen." The breathing had stopped, so had the footsteps, but I knew what I'd heard. "Probably a deer," Sam said, rolling over. "Go back to sleep." I wanted to believe him, but something about that sound didn't feel right. The next day, I couldn't shake the feeling that we were being watched. Every time we stopped to rest, I caught myself glancing over my shoulder. The trees felt closer, darker, like they were hiding something. By the time we made camp that evening, I was on edge. Sam, as usual, brushed it off. He was in his element, cracking jokes and telling stories while I tried to ignore the growing knot in my stomach. That night, the sound came back. This time, it wasn't just footsteps and breathing. It was whispering. I couldn't make out any words, but the voices were low and constant, like a conversation just out of earshot. I sat up in my sleeping bag, heart pounding, and nudged Sam. He didn't wake up. "Sam," I hissed, louder this time. Nothing. Yet he was dead to the world, snoring softly while the whispers grew louder. I grabbed my flashlight and unzipped the tent, stepping outside into the freezing air. The light barely cut through the darkness, but I swept it around the campsite anyway. No one was there. The whispering stopped. Then I heard it, a rustling sound behind me, just outside the tent. I spun around, shining my flashlight, but there was nothing but trees. That's when I saw them. Eyes. Dozens of them, glowing faintly in the darkness. They were high up, too high for any animal I could think of, and they didn't blink. My breath caught in my throat, and I stumbled back into the tent, zipping it shut like that thin layer of nylon would keep me safe. I didn't sleep that night. I just sat there, clutching my flashlight, listening to the whispers and footsteps circling our camp until dawn. When the sun finally rose, I woke Sam and told him we needed to leave. He laughed at me, said I was imagining things, but I refused to argue. I started packing up my gear, and after some grumbling, he did the same. We hit the trail by mid-morning, and for a while, I felt better. The sunlight filtering through the trees made the forest feel less oppressive, and the noises from the night before seemed like a bad dream. But then we found the clearing. It wasn't on the map, and it definitely wasn't on Sam's trail notes. The trees opened up into a wide, grassy field, and in the middle of it stood a cabin. The thing looked ancient, its wooden walls warped and covered in moss. The windows were dark, and the door hung slightly ajar, creaking in the breeze. "Let's check it out," Sam said, already walking toward it. "Are you insane?" I snapped. He just laughed. "It's probably an old ranger station or something. Come on, where's your sense of adventure?" Against my better judgment, I followed him. The air inside the cabin was cold, colder than it should have been, and it smelled like mildew and something else, something metallic, like blood. The floor was littered with debris, broken furniture, scraps of paper, and what looked like claw marks gouged into the wooden walls. This is awesome, Sam said, pulling out his phone to take pictures. I wasn't so sure. Something about the place felt wrong, like it was watching us. Then I noticed the symbols. They were carved into the walls, crude shapes that looked like eyes and jagged teeth, surrounded by lines and spirals that made my head hurt to look at. Let's get out of here, I said, my voice shaking. Sam rolled his eyes but followed me back outside. As soon as we stepped into the clearing, the forest seemed darker. The trees cast long, twisting shadows that didn't match the position of the sun, and the air was heavy, almost suffocating. We didn't talk much as we hiked back to the main trail. Sam was quieter than usual, his face pale, but he wouldn't admit he was spooked. The whispering started again just before sunset. It was louder this time, and it wasn't just in the distance. It was around us, weaving through the trees, growing louder with every step we took. We picked up the pace, practically running by the time we saw the trailhead. But as we reached the parking lot, I realized something was wrong. My car wasn't there. Neither was Sam's. The lot was empty, just a cracked asphalt square surrounded by trees. This isn't right, I muttered, spinning around. We parked here, Sam said, his voice cracking. I know we did. The whispering grew louder, turning into a chorus of voices, and then we saw them. Figures stepping out from the trees. They were human-shaped, but their faces, they were blank. Smooth, featureless like mannequins, but they moved with an eerie, fluid grace. One of them raised a hand, pointing at us, and the voices stopped. Run, I whispered. We took off, sprinting back down the trail. I didn't look back, but I could hear them following, their footsteps impossibly fast and light. We ran for what felt like hours, the forest twisting around us, the trail disappearing beneath our feet. It was as if the woods were alive, shifting and changing to trap us. When we finally stumbled into another clearing, we collapsed, gasping for air. The figures were gone, but the whispers lingered, soft and mocking. We never found our cars. A park ranger found us the next morning wandering along the main road. He said we looked like we'd seen a ghost. I didn't correct him.
Story number 3.
I always thought national parks were places of peace. I never imagined I'd leave one with nightmares that would haunt me for the rest of my life. It happened last spring when my friends Tyler, Megan, and I decided to visit Yellowstone National Park. The trip was Megan's idea. She loved the outdoors and wanted to explore some of the less traveled parts of the park. She convinced us to take a 3-day hike to a remote geyser basin she'd read about online. The first day was perfect. Clear skies, crisp air, and trails winding through stunning forests and meadows. We took photos of wildlife, marveled at the bubbling hot springs, and joked about how we'd write a travel blog about our epic adventure. But by the second day, the mood shifted. We were deep in the wilderness, far from the main trails, when we came across a sign nailed to a tree. It was old and weathered, the words barely legible. "Do not enter. Restricted area." Megan rolled her eyes. "It's probably just to keep tourists away from the good stuff." Tyler hesitated. "Maybe we should head back. This doesn't feel right." But Megan was determined, and I didn't want to be the one to back out. So we kept going. The deeper we ventured, the stranger the forest became. The trees grew taller and denser, their twisted branches blocking out the sunlight. The air smelled sour like rotting vegetation, and the silence was oppressive. Even the birds were gone. Then we found the first set of bones. They were scattered across the trail, bleached white and picked clean. At first, we thought it was an animal, maybe a deer or an elk. But then Tyler found a human skull partially buried in the dirt. "Okay, this is messed up," he said, his voice shaking. "We need to leave." Megan, always the skeptic, laughed nervously. "It's probably just you left over from some archaeological dig or something. Let's keep moving. The geyser basin is close." Against our better judgment, we followed her. By late afternoon, we reached the basin. It should have been beautiful, a hidden treasure of steaming vents and vibrant pools. But the place felt wrong. The geysers hissed and groaned, their plumes of steam rising like ghosts. The pools weren't the usual vivid blues and yellows. They were dark, almost black, and the water bubbled like it was boiling over. There was something else, too, a structure, half hidden by the mist. It looked like a cabin, but it was too dilapidated to be livable. The roof had collapsed in places, and the wooden walls were warped and covered in a black, oily substance. "Who the hell would build a cabin out here?" Tyler muttered. "I'm going to check it out," Megan said, already walking toward it. "Megan, wait," I called, but she didn't listen. Tyler and I exchanged a look before reluctantly following her. The closer we got, the stronger the smell became, something rancid and metallic, like spoiled meat. When we reached the cabin, I noticed strange symbols etched into the wood, spirals and jagged lines that seemed to move if you stared at them too long. Megan pushed the door open, and it creaked on rusted hinges. Inside, the air was thick and suffocating, and the floor was covered in what looked like ash. Then we saw it, a circle drawn in the center of the floor, made of bones, human bones. "Okay, we're done here," Tyler said, backing out of the cabin. But Megan didn't move. She was staring at something on the wall, a mirror, its glass cracked and cloudy. "What's wrong?" I asked, stepping toward her. She didn't answer. Her reflection in the mirror was wrong. It wasn't moving. I grabbed her arm and yanked her away, but the moment we stepped outside, the forest erupted in sound. It wasn't normal noise. It was a cacophony of screams, whispers, and something that sounded like wet footsteps slapping against the ground. "We need to go," Tyler said, his voice barely audible over the din. We ran. The forest seemed alive, the trees bending and twisting to block our path. The ground turned muddy, sucking at our boots, and the air grew colder with every step. I looked back once and immediately regretted it. Something was following us. It wasn't human. It moved on all fours, its limbs impossibly long and thin. Its eyes glowed a sickly yellow, and its mouth was too wide, filled with jagged teeth. It was grinning. "Megan, come on," I shouted, but she had stopped running. She was standing in the middle of the trail, staring back at the thing, her face blank. "Megan!" Tyler screamed, grabbing her arm and dragging her forward. But it was too late. The creature lunged, its limbs snapping like dry branches as it moved. I caught a glimpse of it grabbing Megan, pulling her into the shadows, and then she was gone. Tyler and I didn't stop running until we reached the trailhead. When we finally burst into the ranger station, we must have looked insane. Mud-covered, out of breath, and screaming about something in the forest. The rangers didn't believe us, of course. They said Megan had probably fallen or gotten lost and promised to send out a search party. But I know what I saw. They never found her.
Story number 4.
I had never been to the Grand Canyon before that trip, and after what happened, I'll never go back. My girlfriend, Erin, and I had been dating for 3 years, and she wanted to do something special for her birthday. She suggested a camping trip, far from the crowds, to experience the canyon's quieter, more remote beauty. I wasn't much of a camper, but I couldn't say no. We arrived in early October, the perfect time of year when the weather was cool and the summer tourists had mostly gone. Erin had mapped out a trail she found online, one that wasn't marked on the park's official map. "This is the real adventure," she said, smiling as we laced up our boots. The trail was rough, overgrown in places, and twisted downward into the canyon at a steep angle. It wasn't easy, but Erin was glowing with excitement, and I didn't want to ruin the moment. After several hours, we reached a small plateau. It was breathtaking, red and orange rocks stretching endlessly under a pale blue sky. There wasn't another soul in sight. We set up our tent, cooked dinner over a small fire, and watched the sunset paint the canyon walls in deep purples and golds. As night fell, the temperature dropped quickly, and the stars came out in a way I'd never seen before. "This is perfect," Erin whispered, leaning against me. It should have been. Around midnight, I woke up to a strange sound. It wasn't an animal noise, at least not one I recognized. It was a low, guttural hum, like someone was singing just out of earshot. I nudged Erin awake. "Do you hear that?" She frowned, groggy. "It's probably the wind." But it didn't sound like the wind. I stepped out of the tent, the cold biting through my jacket. The canyon was eerily silent except for the hum, which seemed to be coming from the direction of the trail we'd taken earlier. "Don't go too far," Erin said, her voice nervous now. I didn't plan to. I walked a few yards from the campsite, shining my flashlight along the rocky ground. The beam caught something ahead, a shadow that flickered and moved, even though there was nothing there to cast it. "Hello?" I called, my voice trembling. The humming stopped. The silence that followed was suffocating. I spun around and hurried back to the tent, but Erin wasn't inside. "Erin?" I called, panic rising. Then I saw her. She was standing at the edge of the plateau, staring down into the canyon. "Erin, what are you doing?" She didn't respond. I ran to her, grabbing her arm, but she didn't turn around. Her eyes were wide, unfocused, and she was whispering something under her breath. "Erin, snap out of it." Finally, she blinked and looked at me, confused. "Did you hear it?" she asked. "Hear what?" "The voice," she said, shivering. "It was calling my name." I tried to convince her it was just a bad dream, but the truth was I was scared out of my mind. We decided to pack up and leave first thing in the morning, but the canyon had other plans. Around 3 a.m., I woke up to the sound of footsteps outside the tent. "Erin?" I whispered, but she was asleep next to me. The footsteps grew louder, circling the tent. I grabbed my flashlight and unzipped the flap, shining it into the darkness. Nothing. The footsteps stopped. Then the tent collapsed. Something heavy was pressing down on it, pinning us inside. Erin screamed, and I thrashed, trying to push whatever it was off. It was like fighting against a wall of stone. And then, just as suddenly as it started, it was gone. We scrambled out of the collapsed tent, our breaths clouding in the frigid air. The campsite was empty, but something had left deep gouges in the ground, as if claws had raked through the dirt. "We're leaving," I said, grabbing our gear. We didn't even bother packing the tent. We just started hiking back up the trail, our flashlights barely cutting through the darkness. The trail seemed different on the way back. The canyon walls felt closer, the path narrower, and the humming had returned, louder now, echoing off the rocks. Erin clutched my arm. "It's behind us," she whispered. I didn't want to look, but I did. In the faint glow of my flashlight, I saw it, a figure, impossibly tall and thin, its body a shifting mass of shadows. It had no face, just a gaping void where its head should have been, and it was getting closer. We ran. The trail twisted and turned, the loose rocks slipping under our boots. The humming grew louder, almost deafening, and I could feel it vibrating in my chest, in my teeth. Erin tripped, falling hard onto her hands and knees. I grabbed her, pulling her up, but she was staring at something ahead of us. There, in the middle of the trail, was a man. At least, I think it was a man. He was dressed in old-fashioned clothes, his hat tilted low over his face. He didn't move, didn't speak, just stood there, blocking our path. "Please," Erin begged, "let us go." The man raised his head, and I saw his face. It was hollow, the skin stretched tight over a skull, his eyes sunken and empty. He opened his mouth, and the humming poured out, louder and louder, until I thought my head would split. Then everything went black. I woke up at dawn, lying on the ground near the trailhead. Erin was next to me, pale and shaking, but alive. Our gear was gone, and the gouges in the dirt were the only sign that anything had happened. We stumbled to the nearest ranger station, but when we told them what we'd seen, they just looked at us like we were crazy. I don't know what's out there in the Grand Canyon's remote corners, but it's not meant for us to find.
Story number 5.
I used to love Yosemite National Park. Growing up in California, my family would make an annual trip there every summer. The towering sequoias, crystal clear streams, and awe-inspiring cliffs, it was like stepping into another world. But after what happened 3 years ago, I can't even look at a picture of the place without a knot forming in my stomach. It started with a reunion trip. My best friends Daniel and Emily and I decided we needed a break from our busy lives. We planned a long weekend in Yosemite, hiking a lesser-known trail that Daniel had read about online. He bragged it would give us epic views without the crowds. We arrived at the park on a Thursday morning, the sun just peeking over the horizon. The trail Daniel picked was about an hour's drive from the main valley, leading us deep into the wilderness. By midday, we had hiked several miles and reached a secluded clearing. It was beautiful. Dense forest on one side, a jagged cliff on the other, with a panoramic view of the valley below. We decided to set up camp there for the night. As the sun dipped below the mountains, we lit a small fire and sat around it, laughing and reminiscing. Emily teased Daniel about his obsession with ghost stories, which had been a staple of our childhood camping trips. "Bet you can't scare us this time," she challenged, grinning. Daniel smirked and leaned closer to the fire. "All right, have you guys heard of the Lost Ones?" Emily rolled her eyes. "Oh, here we go." I shrugged. "Never heard of them. What's the story?" Daniel's voice dropped and he stared into the fire as he spoke. "They say there are people who vanish in Yosemite, not from accidents or wild animals, but because something takes them. Rangers call them the Lost Ones, but they don't talk about it publicly. The story goes that if you're deep enough in the woods, you'll start hearing voices, people calling your name. And if you follow those voices, you're never seen again." Emily snorted. "You're ridiculous." "Maybe," Daniel said, shrugging. "But there are reports of hikers hearing things out here. Just saying." The wind picked up, rustling the trees around us, and I couldn't help but feel a little uneasy. We turned in for the night, the fire dying down to glowing embers. The forest was eerily quiet, and I struggled to fall asleep. At some point, I must have dozed off because the next thing I knew, I was jolted awake by a faint sound. James. It was a whisper, distant but unmistakable. I sat up, heart pounding, and looked around. Daniel and Emily were still asleep in their tents. James. The voice came again, clearer this time, drifting in from the direction of the cliff. I crawled out of my tent, the cold night air biting at my skin. The whispering continued, calling my name over and over, laced with a strange urgency. Hello? I called softly, my voice shaking. The whisper stopped. For a moment, there was only silence, and I began to convince myself it was just the wind. But then, from the trees came the faint sound of laughter, low, guttural, and wrong. I froze, every instinct screaming at me to run, but my legs felt rooted to the ground. The laughter grew louder, coming from all directions now, as if the forest itself was mocking me. James! This time, the voice was a scream, and it was coming from Emily's tent. I spun around and yanked open her tent flap. She was gone. Daniel, wake up! I shouted, running to his tent. He stumbled out, groggy and confused. What's going on? Emily's gone. I heard her scream. We grabbed our flashlights and started searching, calling her name. The forest swallowed our voices, the beams of light barely piercing the darkness. After what felt like hours, we reached the edge of the cliff. Daniel shone his flashlight downward, and I prayed we wouldn't see her broken body at the bottom. But there was nothing, just empty space and the faint rustle of the wind. Then we heard it. Help me. It was Emily's voice, weak and trembling, coming from deeper in the woods. Without thinking, we ran toward it, weaving through the trees. The voice grew louder, more desperate, until we reached a clearing. Emily was standing in the center, her back to us. Emily, I cried, relief flooding me, but she didn't turn around. Emily? Daniel said cautiously, stepping closer. She began to hum, a low, haunting tune that sent chills down my spine. Something's wrong, I whispered, grabbing Daniel's arm. Before he could respond, Emily turned to face us. Her eyes were blank, her face pale and gaunt, her mouth twisted into a grin that didn't belong to her. You shouldn't be here, she said, her voice layered with something inhuman. Daniel grabbed my hand and we bolted, the sound of her laughter chasing us through the trees. We didn't stop until we reached the campsite, panting and terrified. What the hell was that? Daniel gasped. I don't know, I said, my voice shaking. But we need to leave. Now. We frantically packed up what little we could carry and started back down the trail. The woods seemed darker, the air heavier, and the whispers returned, calling our names. James, Daniel. I fought the urge to look back, but Daniel wasn't as strong. He froze, staring over my shoulder. Do you see that? He whispered. I turned reluctantly and my stomach dropped. There, standing just beyond the trees, were figures, pale, motionless, their eyes glowing faintly in the darkness. They looked human, but their faces were hollow, their limbs too long and thin. They didn't move, but I could feel their gaze on us. Run, I whispered. We sprinted down the trail, the figures fading in and out of the trees like shadows. The whispers grew louder, overlapping into a cacophony that made it impossible to think. At one point, Daniel stumbled, and I had to drag him to his feet. We're almost there, I shouted, though I wasn't sure if it was true. Finally, we burst out of the woods and onto the road where our car was parked. We didn't stop running until we were inside, locking the doors behind us. We sat there in stunned silence, the engine idling as we tried to catch our breath. Do you think she's still out there? Daniel asked, his voice barely above a whisper. I didn't answer. I couldn't. We left without looking back. To this day, I don't know what happened to Emily. Search parties never found any trace of her, and sometimes late at night I still hear her voice. James.
Story number 6.
A few years ago, I took a solo trip to Great Smoky Mountains National Park. I was burnt out from work, tired of city life, and needed a break. The Smokies had always felt like the perfect escape. Serene, sprawling forests, mist-covered mountains, and an unshakable sense of tranquility. I planned a 3-day trek, starting on a lesser-traveled trail that wound deep into the wilderness. I wanted solitude, and I got it. For the first day and a half, I didn't encounter a single soul. It was perfect, until it wasn't. On the second night, I set up camp near a small creek. The sound of rushing water was soothing, and the towering trees seemed to cocoon me in safety. I made a small fire, ate a quick dinner, and slipped into my tent just as darkness settled over the woods. At some point during the night, I woke up to the sound of movement. It wasn't unusual. Animals often wandered near campsites, curious about the smells of food. I stayed still, listening carefully, The crunching of leaves was deliberate, slow, too slow. I held my breath, straining to hear. Then came the faint sound of humming, low, melodic, and unmistakably human. My stomach twisted. I told myself it had to be another hiker passing by, maybe someone who hadn't seen my tent in the darkness. But the humming grew louder, closer, circling my campsite. "Hello?" I called, my voice cracking. The humming stopped. Silence enveloped the forest up, so complete it felt oppressive. I sat frozen in my sleeping bag, my heart pounding in my chest. Then I heard it. Footsteps, heavy and deliberate, moving around my tent. I scrambled for my flashlight and unzipped the tent just enough to shine the beam outside. The forest was empty. "Is someone there?" I shouted, trying to sound braver than I felt. No response. I scanned the area, the flashlight shaking in my hand. The footsteps stopped, and for a moment, I thought I might have imagined it all. But just as I began to lower the flashlight, I saw it. A figure, standing at the edge of the trees, barely illuminated by the faint glow of my dying fire. They were tall, unnaturally so, and thin, their limbs slightly too long. Their face was obscured by the shadow. I could see their head tilting, as if watching me. I blinked, and they were gone. I didn't sleep the rest of the night, clutching my flashlight and bear spray, and jumping at every sound. By morning, the forest seemed normal again, sunlight streaming through the trees, birds chirping cheerfully. I convinced myself it was just my imagination, fueled by exhaustion and the eerie stillness of the woods. Determined to shake off the fear, I packed up and continued hiking. The trail became steeper, winding up the side of a mountain, and I had to focus on each step to avoid slipping on the loose dirt. By late afternoon, I reached a clearing with a breathtaking view of the valley below. I decided to rest there, sitting on a fallen log and drinking water from my canteen. The peacefulness of the moment almost made me forget about the night before. Almost. As I sat there, I noticed something odd. There was a tree at the edge of the clearing, its bark stripped clean in long, jagged streaks. It looked like claw marks, but no animal I knew of could reach that high. A chill ran down my spine, and I decided it was time to move on. The trail became narrower as it descended into a dense section of forest. The sunlight barely filtered through the canopy, and the air grew colder. I felt like I was being watched. Every now and then I'd hear faint sounds, branches snapping, leaves rustling. But whenever I stopped to listen, the forest went silent. By the time the sun began to set, I knew I needed to find a place to camp. But every spot I came across felt wrong, as if the forest itself was warning me not to stop. Finally, I found a small clearing and reluctantly set up my tent. I built a fire, more for comfort than warmth, and tried to eat, but my appetite was gone. As darkness fell, the forest seemed to close in around me. The sense of being watched grew stronger, and every crackle of the firewood made me jump. Then, just as the fire began to die down, I heard it again, the humming. It was faint at first, drifting through the trees, but it grew louder, more insistent. My hands trembled as I grabbed my flashlight, shining it into the darkness. "Who's there?" I demanded, my voice shaking. The humming stopped, replaced by laughter, low, guttural, and chilling. Something moved at the edge of the clearing, just beyond the reach of the firelight. I backed toward my tent, gripping the flashlight like a weapon. "Stay away!" I shouted, but my voice sounded small and weak. The laughter grew louder, echoing through the trees. Then, from the darkness, the figure emerged. It was the same one I'd seen the night before, tall, thin, its limbs moving with an unnatural fluidity. Its face was still obscured, but I could feel its gaze piercing through me. It took a step closer, and I bolted. I didn't think, didn't grab anything. I just ran, crashing through the forest, branches clawing at my arms and legs. The laughter followed me, along with the sound of heavy footsteps, impossibly fast and close. I don't know how long I ran, but eventually I stumbled onto the trail. My legs burned, my lungs ached, but I kept going, too terrified to look back. Finally, I saw a light, a ranger station at the edge of the park. I burst inside, gasping for air, and collapsed onto the floor. The rangers helped me up, their faces filled with concern. "What happened?" one of them asked. I tried to explain, but the words wouldn't come out. All I could do was point back toward the forest. One of the rangers nodded grimly. "You're not the first," he said quietly. They let me stay there for the night, and by morning they escorted me back to my car. I never went back to the Smokies. I never went hiking again. Sometimes late at night, I still hear that humming in my dreams. And when I wake up, I can't get the feeling that something is standing just outside my window, waiting.
Story number 7.
I don't think I'll ever forget what happened last summer when I visited Big Bend National Park in Texas. My girlfriend Emily and I had been planning this trip for months. The idea was to spend a few days exploring the rugged desert landscapes, camping under the stars, and disconnecting from the noise of the city. What we experienced instead was a nightmare I still can't fully explain. The trip started out fine. We arrived at the park in the early afternoon, set up our tent at a remote campsite, and spent the day hiking one of the more popular trails. The views were incredible: massive canyons, twisting rivers, and endless stretches of desert. We barely saw another person the whole time, which made the park feel even more vast and untouched. That evening, after a simple dinner, we sat by the fire, talking and watching the stars come out. The sky was so clear, it felt like you could see every star in the universe. By the time we went to bed, the only sound was the occasional rustle of wind through the dry brush. Sometime in the middle of the night, I woke up. At first, I wasn't sure why. The air inside the tent felt heavy, and for a moment, I thought it was just the oppressive desert heat. But then I heard it, a faint noise, like someone whispering just outside. I turned to Emily, but she was still asleep. I held my breath and listened. The whispering didn't stop. It wasn't a single voice, though. It sounded like several people murmuring, their words indistinct and overlapping. I unzipped the tent as quietly as I could and peeked outside. The moonlight lit up the desert, casting eerie shadows across the sand and rocks. At first, I didn't see anything. But then, out of the corner of my eye, I noticed movement. About 50 yards away, just at the edge of the campsite, a figure stood motionless. It was tall and thin, its features obscured in the dim light. It looked like it was wearing some kind of long, tattered robe, but it wasn't moving, just standing there, watching. My stomach dropped, and my first instinct was to wake Emily. But when I turned back to her, the whispering grew louder, as if warning me not to move. I slowly turned my gaze back toward the figure, but it was gone. I spent the rest of the night wide awake, clutching my flashlight and listening to every sound outside. By morning, I was convinced it was just my imagination, some combination of fatigue and the eerie isolation of the desert. I didn't mention it to Emily. I didn't want to scare her, and I was sure it wouldn't happen again. The second day was uneventful. We hiked a more challenging trail, taking in the breathtaking views and trying to shake off the strange vibe from the night before. By the time we got back to the campsite, we were exhausted. That night, though, everything changed. It started with the same whispering. This time, Emily heard it too. She shook me awake, her face pale in the dim light of the tent. "Do you hear that?" she whispered. I nodded, my heart pounding. The voices were louder now, clearer. It sounded like they were coming from all around us, but no matter how hard we strained to make out the words, we couldn't. It was like they were speaking in some ancient, guttural language. Then came the footsteps, soft at first, crunching on the dry ground. Emily grabbed my arm, her grip tight enough to hurt. "Who's out there?" she called, her voice trembling. The footsteps stopped. The whispering, however, grew louder, more insistent. It was almost as if the voices were arguing amongst themselves. I grabbed my flashlight and unzipped the tent, shining the beam outside. The campsite was empty. The fire had burned out hours ago, and the desert was eerily still. But just as I was about to turn off the flashlight, I saw them. Figures. Not one, but several, standing at the edge of the campsite. They were all tall and impossibly thin, their bodies draped in tattered dark clothing. Their faces were hidden in shadows, but I could feel their eyes on me, unblinking. "What do you want?" I shouted, my voice cracking. The whispering stopped. For a moment, there was nothing but silence, and then in unison, the figures tilted their heads to the side, as if curious. That was when Emily screamed. I spun around to see her pointing toward the opposite side of the campsite. Another figure was standing there, closer than the others, its head cocked at the same unnatural angle. "We have to go," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. "Now." We grabbed what we could, our phones, the car keys, and not much else, and bolted for the trail leading back to the parking lot. The figures didn't follow us, at least not at first. But as we ran, the whispering started again, echoing through the darkness. I don't know how long we ran. The trail felt endless, and every time we thought we'd put distance between us and the campsite, the whispering would grow louder, as if they were right behind us. At one point, Emily tripped and fell, scraping her knees on the rocky ground. I helped her up, and as we paused to catch our breath, I looked back. They were there, standing in the distance, their silhouettes barely visible in the moonlight. But this time, they weren't still. They were moving toward us, slow and deliberate. We didn't stop again until we reached the car. By some miracle, the figures didn't appear in the parking lot, but we didn't take any chances. We jumped in, locked the doors, and sped off, leaving the park behind. It wasn't until we were miles away on the main highway that we finally spoke. "What the hell were those things?" Emily asked, her voice shaking. I didn't have an answer. I still don't. We reported the incident to the park rangers the next day. They listened patiently, but their expressions told us everything we needed to know. They didn't believe us. One of them mentioned that the area had a history of strange occurrences, stories passed down by local tribes about spirits that guarded the land. He said it with a smile, as if it were just a ghost story. But it wasn't just a story. I know what I saw, what we experienced. And I know I'll never set foot in Big Bend or any national park again. Sometimes, late at night, I can still hear the whispering.
Story number 8.
Last fall, I decided to visit Shenandoah National Park in Virginia. I was in desperate need of solitude, and the idea of hiking the misty Blue Ridge Mountains sounded perfect. The park had a reputation for its serene beauty, with its rolling hills, waterfalls, and dense forests, but my experience there was anything but peaceful. I had chosen a remote trail called White Rock Canyon for my hike. The trail wasn't one of the popular ones, which was exactly what I wanted. Something off the beaten path, away from crowds. I parked my car at the trailhead just as the late afternoon sun started dipping below the mountains. From the start, something felt off. The forest was too quiet. I'd hiked plenty of trails before and was used to the rustling of leaves, the distant chirps of birds, or the occasional sound of animals moving through the underbrush. But here, there was nothing, just the crunch of my boots on the dirt path and the faint whistle of the wind. I told myself it was just my imagination, that the silence was part of the forest's charm. But the further I went, the more the unease grew. The trail was narrow, winding through dense woods that seemed to stretch on forever. The trees were so tightly packed that they blocked out most of the fading sunlight, casting long, eerie shadows. About an hour in, I noticed something strange. Carvings. They were etched into the trunks of several trees along the trail. At first, I thought they were just random scratches, the work of weather or animals. But as I got closer, I realized they were deliberate symbols: circles, triangles, and strange spirals. Some were accompanied by crude stick figures, their arms stretched upward as if in worship. A shiver ran down my spine, but I brushed it off. People carve into trees all the time, right? Probably just some kids messing around. As the sun dipped lower, the trail began to feel different. The air grew colder, and the woods seemed darker than they should have been. I checked my phone for the time, 4:45 p.m., and noticed I had no signal. Typical for a place like this, but it didn't help my nerves. Then I smelled it. It was faint at first, but unmistakable, a sickly, metallic scent like rust or decaying meat. I stopped and looked around, but the forest was still and empty. My heart started to race. There was no logical reason for that smell to be here. I decided to head back. As I turned around, something caught my eye. Further down the trail, maybe 20 yards away, stood a figure. It was partially hidden behind a tree, but I could see enough to know it wasn't normal. It was tall, with unnaturally long limbs and a head that seemed too large for its body. Its skin was pale, almost gray, and it didn't move. Just stood there, watching me. My breath caught in my throat. For a moment, I couldn't move, couldn't think. Then, as if my body decided for me, I started walking backward, keeping my eyes on the figure. It didn't follow, at least not at first. When I was about 10 steps away, it shifted. Its head tilted to the side like a predator sizing up its prey. Then it stepped out from behind the tree, moving with a strange, jerky motion, almost like it didn't know how to walk properly. That's when I ran. I sprinted down the trail, my backpack bouncing against my shoulders. The forest around me blurred as I focused on the path ahead, my only goal to get back to my car. But the faster I ran, the louder the sounds behind me grew. Footsteps. Heavy, deliberate, and impossibly fast. I dared a glance over my shoulder and immediately regretted it. The thing was chasing me. Its long limbs moved like a spider's, propelling it forward with unnatural speed. Its mouth hung open, revealing rows of sharp, uneven teeth. But what terrified me most were its eyes, black, hollow pits that seemed to pull in all the light around them. I pushed myself harder, ignoring the burning in my legs and the sharp pains in my chest. The trail felt endless, and I couldn't tell how far I was from the parking lot. Then up ahead, I saw it, a small wooden bridge that I remembered crossing earlier. Relief flooded me. The trailhead wasn't far beyond it, but just as I reached the bridge, something changed. The air grew thick, almost suffocating, and the forest seemed to warp around me. The trees twisted into unnatural shapes, their branches curling like claws. The path beneath my feet felt soft, like it was alive and trying to pull me down, and the thing behind me was getting closer. I stumbled onto the bridge, my foot catching on one of the wooden planks. I fell hard, scraping my palms and knees. When I looked up, the figure was standing at the edge of the bridge, its head tilted at that same unnerving angle. It didn't move, didn't attack. It just stood there, staring at me. And then, in a voice that didn't belong in this world, it spoke. Leave. The word was guttural, almost animalistic, but the meaning was clear. I didn't need to be told twice. I scrambled to my feet and ran as fast as I could, not stopping until I reached the trailhead. When I finally saw my car, I almost cried with relief. I jumped in, locked the doors, and started the engine. As I drove away, I glanced in the rearview mirror. The figure was standing at the edge of the parking lot, watching me go. I didn't stop driving until I was miles away from the park. Even then, I didn't feel safe. To this day, I don't know what I saw or why it let me go. All I know is that something ancient and malevolent lives in those woods, and it doesn't like visitors.
Story number 9.
It was last October when my friends and I decided to take a weekend trip to the Great Smoky Mountains National Park. We'd heard stories about how beautiful the trails were during the fall, with vibrant reds and oranges painting the landscape. It sounded like the perfect escape from our dull routines. We were a group of 4, me, Kyle, Emily, and Jenna, and we all loved the outdoors, or at least we thought we did. Our plan was to camp for 2 nights and hike up to Klingman's Dome, a popular spot for its breathtaking views. Kyle, being the most adventurous among us, suggested we take an older, lesser-known trail called the Whispering Ridge. The name itself felt eerie, but Kyle assured us it was just a shortcut he'd read about online. It wasn't on the official park map, but curiosity got the better of us. We set out late in the afternoon, backpacks loaded, spirits high. The trail started innocently enough, winding through dense woods with leaves crunching under our boots. But as we moved deeper into the forest, the air grew heavier, colder. The cheerful chatter among us faded as an unsettling silence took over. Even the usual forest sounds, bird calls, rustling leaves, seemed absent. About an hour in, Jenna stopped suddenly. "Did you hear that?" she whispered. We all froze, straining to listen. At first, there was nothing but the faint rustling of the wind through the trees. Then we heard it, a low, guttural hum, like someone was chanting just out of earshot. It didn't sound like words, more like an endless drone vibrating in the air. Kyle laughed nervously. "Probably just the wind. Let's keep moving." But the sound didn't stop. It seemed to follow us, growing louder and more distinct the further we hiked. Emily was visibly shaken, clutching her jacket tightly around her. "Maybe we should turn back," she said. "We're almost at the ridge," Kyle insisted. "We can't turn back now. It's probably just some weird acoustics or an echo." Reluctantly, we pressed on. The trail narrowed and the trees seemed to close in around us. Strange symbols started appearing on the trunks, spirals, crosses, and handprints that looked like they'd been burned into the bark. Jenna stopped again, staring at one of the trees. "This isn't normal," she said, her voice trembling. "Okay, I'll admit it's creepy," Kyle said, "but it's probably just someone messing with hikers. Let's not freak out." We reached the ridge just as the sun dipped below the horizon, casting a fiery glow over the mountains. For a brief moment, the view was worth it, and the unease lifted. But as soon as darkness began to settle, the chanting returned. Louder, closer. This time, it wasn't just a hum. It was a chorus of voices chanting in unison, low and guttural. The sound came from all directions, echoing through the trees. Panic set in. "We need to get out of here," Emily said, her voice almost a scream. Kyle finally agreed. "All right, back the way we came. Let's go." But as we turned to retrace our steps, we realized the trail had changed. The path we'd come up on was gone, replaced by dense undergrowth and twisted trees. "This isn't possible," Kyle muttered, his voice shaking. The chanting grew louder, and now we could hear footsteps, heavy, deliberate, and getting closer. A faint light appeared in the distance, flickering like a torch. Jenna grabbed my arm. "What is that?" "I don't know, and I don't want to find out," I said. "Run." We sprinted down what we hoped was the right direction, dodging branches and stumbling over roots. The footsteps and chanting followed us, growing louder and more frenzied. The light moved with us, weaving through the trees like it was alive. Out of breath and desperate, we burst into a small clearing. In the center stood an old, crumbling stone altar, covered in moss and more of those strange symbols. Around it were more handprints, smeared in what looked like dried blood. The air was thick with the metallic tang of iron. This wasn't here before, Emily stammered, backing away. Before anyone could respond, the chanting stopped. The silence was deafening, and for a moment I thought maybe it was over. Then the light appeared again, hovering at the edge of the clearing. It wasn't a torch, it was a figure. The figure stood nearly 7 feet tall, cloaked in shadows that seemed to ripple like smoke. Its face was a void, a blank, featureless expanse that seemed to draw in all the light around it. As it stepped closer, the air grew colder, the kind of cold that bites into your bones. "Run," Kyle whispered, but none of us moved. We were frozen, trapped in the figure's gaze, or lack thereof. Then it raised an arm, long and skeletal, and pointed directly at us. A sound like a deep, guttural growl erupted from its chest, and that was enough to break the spell. We bolted, not caring where we were going, just desperate to get away. The forest seemed alive, the trees twisting and shifting to block our path. The ground beneath us felt soft, like it was swallowing our feet. The figure didn't follow us, but its presence was everywhere, an oppressive weight pressing down on us. Finally, we stumbled onto a dirt road. I didn't even recognize it, but it didn't matter. We ran until we saw headlights in the distance. A ranger's truck. The ranger stopped, clearly startled by our wild, disheveled appearance. "What happened to you kids?" he asked. We tried to explain, but our story sounded insane even to us. He listened, his face growing pale. "You were on Whispering Ridge?" he asked. We nodded. He sighed, shaking his head. "That trail's been closed for decades. Too many incidents. People disappearing, strange sightings. You're lucky you made it out." He drove us back to the main campground, and we packed up and left that night. None of us spoke during the drive home, too shaken to process what had happened. I haven't been back to the Smokies since, and I never will.
Story number 10.
A year ago, my cousin Jake convinced me to join him on a camping trip to Yosemite National Park. He'd always been obsessed with the idea of finding secret spots, places that weren't on the official maps. Jake swore he'd discovered a hidden meadow deep in the park, a place untouched by tourists, a slice of paradise. I wasn't much of an adventurer, but Jake's enthusiasm was infectious, and I reluctantly agreed. We set off on a crisp October morning, loaded with supplies. The first day was incredible. Towering pines, crystal clear streams, and the kind of serenity you can't find in the city. Jake led the way with his compass and a printout of some obscure directions he'd found online. By the second day, we were miles off the beaten path, completely alone, or so we thought. That evening, as we set up camp, I noticed something odd. The trees around our site had deep scratches etched into their bark, like claw marks. They were too high up to be from a bear. Jake laughed it off, saying they were probably old scars from falling branches or storms. But they didn't look natural to me. The lines were deliberate, almost like symbols. As the sun dipped below the horizon, the forest became eerily quiet. No birds, no insects, just the crackling of our fire. I tried to focus on Jake's stories, but my eyes kept drifting to the darkness beyond the firelight. It felt like the woods were watching us. Around midnight, I woke up to the sound of footsteps. Not the distant rustling of animals, but deliberate, heavy steps circling our campsite. I froze, my heart pounding in my chest. Jake was snoring softly in his sleeping bag, oblivious. I strained to listen, holding my breath. The steps stopped just outside my tent. Then came the breathing. It was low, raspy, and unnatural, like someone struggling to suck in air. I wanted to call out to Jake, but fear pinned me in place. After what felt like an eternity, the breathing moved away and the footsteps faded into the trees. I lay awake until dawn, too terrified to sleep. When Jake finally woke up, I told him what I'd heard. He teased me for having an overactive imagination, but I could see the unease in his eyes. Still, he insisted we keep going. "We're close to the meadow," he said, "and you'll see it's worth it." Reluctantly, I followed him deeper into the forest. The farther we went, the stranger things became. The air grew colder, even though the sun was shining. We found more claw marks on the trees, now accompanied by small piles of stones arranged in perfect circles. The forest itself seemed wrong. Trees twisted unnaturally, their branches reaching down like skeletal hands. By late afternoon, we stumbled upon the meadow. Jake was ecstatic, shouting about how beautiful and untouched it was. And he wasn't wrong. The grass was lush and green, wet dotted with wildflowers. But something about it felt off. The silence was absolute. No birds, no wind, nothing. Just the sound of our boots crunching the grass. In the center of the meadow stood a massive tree, ancient and gnarled. Its bark was blackened like it had been struck by lightning, and its roots twisted out of the ground like veins. Jake, ever the explorer, decided we should set up camp under it. I protested, but he waved me off, calling me paranoid. That night, the nightmare began. As we sat by the fire, Jake suddenly went quiet, staring into the darkness. "Did you see that?" he whispered. "See what?" I asked, my stomach tightening. "There," he pointed toward the edge of the meadow. Something moved. I squinted but saw nothing. "Probably a deer," I said, trying to convince myself as much as him. But Jake wasn't convinced. He stood, shining his flashlight into the trees. The beam caught something, a reflection like eyes, too high off the ground to belong to any animal I knew. Before I could say anything, the light flickered, and the fire went out, plunging us into darkness. Panic set in as we scrambled to relight the fire. Jake's hands were shaking so badly he dropped the lighter twice. When the flames finally roared back to life, we realized we weren't alone. Standing at the edge of the firelight was a figure. At first, it looked like a man, tall and thin, but its proportions were wrong. Its arms were too long, its head tilted unnaturally to one side. The eyes glowed faintly, reflecting the firelight. "Who's there?" Jake called out, his voice cracking. The figure didn't answer. It just stood there, motionless, staring. Then, without a sound, it stepped back into the shadows and disappeared. "We're leaving. Now," I said, grabbing my pack. Jake nodded, for once not arguing. We doused the fire and started back toward the way we'd come, using our flashlights to navigate. The forest seemed alive, closing in around us. Every snap of a twig made us jump, and the feeling of being watched was unbearable. Then the whispers started, faint at first, like the wind, but growing louder. It was a language I couldn't understand, guttural and harsh. The words overlapped, coming from every direction. Jake was panicking, spinning in circles with his flashlight. "This isn't happening. This isn't real," he muttered. But it was real, and it was getting closer. The whispers turned to screams, deafening and inhuman. Shadows moved between the trees, too fast to follow. I grabbed Jake's arm and pulled him forward, shouting for him to run. We sprinted blindly through the forest, branches clawing at our faces and packs. Suddenly, Jake tripped and fell hard, his flashlight skittering away. I turned to help him, but he was staring at something behind me, his face pale. "Don't look," he whispered. I didn't listen. I turned. The figure was there, only now there were more of them. Dozens, maybe hundreds, standing in a loose circle around us. Their eyes glowed faintly and their bodies seemed to flicker, like static on a screen. They didn't move, just stared. "Get up!" I screamed at Jake, pulling him to his feet. We ran, ignoring the branches tearing at our skin and the whispers filling our heads. By some miracle, we burst out onto a dirt road just as the first light of dawn broke through the trees. A park ranger's truck was parked a few yards away, and we ran to it, shouting for help. The ranger looked at us like we were crazy, but he let us climb into the truck. As he drove us back to the main station, Jake and I sat in stunned silence, too terrified to speak. When we finally told the ranger what had happened, his face went pale. "You boys were lucky," he said. "People who go that deep into the woods, well, not all of them come back." Jake and I never spoke about it again. But I still dream about those figures, their glowing eyes and the way they just watched. I haven't set foot in a national park since, and I never will.